Hello, my name's Dr. Stolz and I'm from Trobe University, and today I've got with me here is Professor Jānis Ozoliņš, or aka John for his Australian name. Welcome and thank you for accepting my invitation.
Pleasure.
So today I've asked Jānis to speak to me, and I'm going to speak to him about his latest work and research in the space of civil society, education and human formation. And so let's get into this. Let's ask a few questions, which I'm sure a lot of you are probably wondering about. So the first one will be, look, how do you see the state of democracy in contemporary society today? For example, I've just come back from the United States, and a number of my academic colleagues speak about the political situation over there with Donald Trump as the recently elected president, and it's obviously generated a lot of interest in the media. So I think this is a really good question to ask. So, Jānis.
Well, look, I think, while I don't think entirely that democracy's in crisis, as some commentators would suggest, I do think there are real issues with democracy, especially as it's practiced. The idea of liberal democracy, I think, is in serious trouble in some respects. I mean, I think the United States is an example of some of the difficulties. One of the difficulties being is that, in fact, what we have is oligarchy. And you think about how much money is spent on campaigns, presidential campaigns. In particular, Donald Trump used a reasonable amount of his own money in all of this, and some of the other people who were vying for the candidatures for president also needed to raise huge amounts of money, some of which was some of their own money, but in most cases not. You come to Australia, we similarly have some issues with the amount of money that now needs to be spent on campaigns. What that means, I think, in terms of democracy is that only a certain kind of elite are now able to participate fully in the processes of electing leaders. To be sure, everybody gets a vote, but if the way in which the elections are decided is through the amount of advertising that is able to be facilitated by the amount of money that's being spent, that says something. But the other side of the thing, of course, is the issue about people not being listened to anymore. I mean, one of the major problems, Brexit is an example there. Also, that people are now wondering, how did that happen? There is a malaise, I think, in terms of democracy and democratic process. And I have some, I guess, some reasons why I think that's occurring. Some of which I think have to do with the changing kinds of values in society, which are, despite preaching tolerance and individual autonomy and the like, what we're actually seeing is a kind of rise of intolerance and totalitarianism. That is, certain kinds of views are no longer able to be freely expressed in society. There is a sort of rise in which the idea that political views now have to conform to what some people might call political correctness. That there is despite the fact of relativism and a lack of interest in truth, in fact we're getting the rejection of truth, and that it seems to me is problematic. So I think the democracy, whilst it's not going to disappear, nevertheless the kind of democracy we have is not particularly strong, I would say.
So in terms of, and I know we spoke very briefly about it before, clearly Trump is a response to what's come before, and he's a product of the current culture and society, or climate, if you like, of America. So would you agree with me that it's obviously a balance or a a recalibration to the right as a result of, if you like, maybe a swing to the left with, say, some kind of policies that were implemented in some of the political ideologies and so on from the Democratic Party and so on, from Obama's term and so on. So would you say that that is a fair representation of Trump and obviously the current political climate, if we use the American example? You know, it's a swing or it's a recalibration to the right, and that there'll be some kind of balancing somewhere at some point, or is that probably too generous?
I think it's probably too generous. I actually think, going back to my comments about oligarchy, I think one of the problems is that the way in which, particularly in the States, it seems to me, is that, and here I'm not, I guess I'm looking from without rather than from within, but looking from afar, it seems to me that the whole process in the whole democratic process in the States has been to some extent undermined by lobby groups that in fact representatives now are basically being in some way suborned by various vociferous groups. And so they're responding to, it seems to me, those who have the loudest voices, and also there's and this is something that Hayek has pointed out, and someone who is an apostle of the right, I might add, has some interesting things to say in relation to democracy. In particular, the idea that in the processes we have today, because many of these representatives are beholden to particular interest groups who put them into power, they then, once they're in power, then have to respond and say, okay, so if you say the the shopkeepers
appease
union,
the donors,
you have to appease the donors. So we, the mining industry, have given donations to your particular party and also to elect you. Well, we want something in return. Now, there may not be, it's not like here's a paper bag of money and therefore you now vote in a particular way, but it's not as crude as that. But when you think about the ways in which differing groups will pressure representatives, they become beholden to those representatives because that's how they get to be voted in. So that, I think, is one of the difficulties. And now, it's not quite so bad in Australia, but we do now beginning to have some of the same kind of thing where ex-politicians who know the way around Canberra will also lobby on the behalf of particular groups, and so you're getting a differing kind of understanding of what democracy is about. It's basically pressure groups and lobby groups that are influencing the directions in which legislation.
And you can wonder why Joe Blow in the street feels disillusioned and feels like he hasn't got a voice.
Well, he has.
How can you compete against that?
Well, you can't, and that's the problem. I mean, clearly, if you could develop your own little lobby group, well, yes, of course you would then perhaps succeed in having your voice heard. But it seems to me it's very difficult for the ordinary person to be able to do that. And I think this is, and the other side of this, of course, is that politics has become professionalised. That now you don't get the range of occupations in Parliament anymore. I mean, Ben Chifley was a train driver. Now, you're never going to get a train driver as a Prime Minister again. Why? Because everybody now, it's a career. So you begin as an intern working as a lowly person in somebody's political office. You then rise up the ranks to be the person in charge of the office, for example, and so on. And so then, of course, you then, if you're the press person, well, then eventually maybe you too will stand for a seat at some particular election. So you basically have a very narrow number of professions now, which from which politicians are drawn. I mean, I would say lawyers are the largest.
Well, they're certainly overrepresented, that's for sure, in terms of the political class. Now, I'm just noticing the time, so let's move on to our next question. So, again, to a lot of people, this would be a controversial type of question to ask, but let's have a look at this, because I know you have spoken a lot, you've written a lot about this. This is obviously part of your research, and obviously come from a ACU, or Australian Catholic University, and so, of course, religion, I would like to think, takes an important role in the place of this university, and not just in name alone, but so obviously the question is, what role do you see religion playing in democracy today? For a lot of people, they don't necessarily want to see that. So first of all, why? What's this emphasis on why religion? Why is this even important, particularly in the democratic process, which is meant to be secular? So,
yeah. Well, look, I think that this is a mistake. I mean, the idea that religion has no place in democracy is a misunderstanding of the relation between church and state. I mean, the idea is, sure, you don't want your Archbishop of Canberra also doubling up as Prime Minister. Now, if that's what you mean by a separation of church and state, well, that's fine. But what people tend to do these days is that on some of the hot button issues, for example, euthanasia, for example, so-called gay marriage, if you express an opinion which is in opposition to what seems to be the sort of loudest view within the community, it's generally labelled, well, of course you'll believe that, or of course you oppose that because you're coming from a religious perspective. Now, it seems to me that this is a mistake, and that religion does have, if we're serious about a liberal democracy which values the expression of different kinds of points of view, then of course religion must have a role, and indeed a vital role to play in democracy. I might add that in fact Western democracy has its basis in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's being repudiated a little bit, but in fact the origins of our modern kinds of understandings of the importance of the human person, of the centrality of respect for person, stems from that Judeo-Christian tradition. I mean, people forget how important, for example, the role of women has been promoted, for instance, in Christianity. I mean, it was St. Paul himself who says, you know, in Christ there is no male, then it's no female, that we're one and the same. And that's sometimes forgotten. He's often painted as a misogynist. So it seems to me that in actual fact, religion has an important role in supporting democracy. But the point, you know, here is really about the way in which it's too easy to say, dismiss an argument about, for instance, against euthanasia or assisted suicide, or, you know, assisted dying, as the new euphemism puts it, by just simply saying, well, that's a religious point of view, without actually looking at reason and the reasons that are given. Religion can be as much rational as any other kind of particular point of view. I mean, so I think there is an issue here, and it's a worrying trend, which is part of a kind of diminution of freedom of speech, that if you express a view which some people don't agree with, you immediately label as, oh, well, of course you would say that because you're religious. That, in fact, is what we would call in philosophy an informal fallacy. You know, it's ad hominem, in fact, you know, that you basically, oh, well, you know, of course you think that because, well, you're a religious person. Well, that's not why you say certain kinds of things. So I think religion has an important role to play in democracy, because centrally to religion is the idea of respect for persons, and valuing the opinions of all. And the other side of this, I think, too, is a recognition that governments need to govern for everyone, not just the loudest voice, not just for the majority. Aristotle himself once said that, you know, a bad democracy is where you get tyranny of the majority. Now, what did he mean by that? What he meant by that is that every government isn't just governing for the sake of those who voted for them. So hence, you know, it isn't just a matter of the lobby groups. This is why in that first question we're talking about what has been one of the problems with Western democracy. It's because it's been taken over to some extent by lobby groups who are interested only in their own particular point of view.
It's certainly not representative of, if you like, a full cross-section, if you like.
That's right, it's not. And I think this is why I think I'm not saying religion reminds people of this, but it's a symptom that a religion tends to be excluded merely on the basis that it's apparently a religious kind of view. And it's paradoxical in one sense in that if we are truly tolerant, then presumably we will want to encompass in determining policy in different kinds of directions all viewpoints, when in the long run the laws are meant for everyone, not just for those who are the majority, or not for the convenience of those who happen to hold a particular point of view. It has to be for all, and I think this is why religion is vital in a democracy, and why it oughtn't to be excluded from playing an important part in the democratic process.
I know we talked very briefly about it before, but a lot of this has to do with obviously a rejection of metaphysics, particularly Christian theological understandings, if you like, of the human person and what that person might look like within a kind of ordered society. Now, what do you think has led to this rejection of a metaphysical view, which, if you like, stems from really Christian theology, really? You talked about the Judeo-Christian kind of frameworks. Okay, we can keep it broad like that, but what do you see as the main kind of catalyst and the main reasons why you think there's been a rejection of this kind of metaphysical understandings?
Well, I think you're right, there is a general rejection of metaphysics.
Yeah.
I think part of that, I guess the influence of a general rejection of a connection between philosophy and theology, which goes back to the Enlightenment. I suspect that's where it begins, and you see sort of in some modern continental writers the idea that they talk about the end of metaphysics. That despite them saying that, of course, they're full of metaphysics.
Oh yes.
It's not like you can avoid metaphysics. I mean, any kind of ontology, it's about what's in the world. I mean, you've got to begin with some basic kinds of self-evident premises about what the world is like. Maybe the last great metaphysician was Kant. Kant doesn't reject metaphysics. Those who come after him perhaps are less inclined to accept that there is a metaphysics. And I think there is partly also a kind of rejection of realism. I mean, and foundationalism. Part of this is a kind of understanding that there is no truth. Once you begin to sort of question the idea that there's any truth, once you begin to question the idea of any foundations of any kind, then I think you end up in a place which begins to look very relativistic, begins to reject values and any kind of understanding that there is a common human nature, for example. I mean, Rorty doesn't believe there is. There's also then a rejection of science. I mean, I think that's where you end up. We're actually getting to the point where people now reject science itself and say, well, what can science tell us about the world? It can't tell us anything much. At the same time, expecting technology to save the world, as it were. So there's I think there are a number of currents of thought which are part of this sort of idea that there is no metaphysics, but in fact my own view about this is that they're actually in the it's an incoherence to try and reject metaphysics. You might want to reject certain kinds of metaphysics, obviously, and you may question, the idea of what kind of ontology you ought to have, but it seems to me it's impossible to do without some kind of ontology. I mean, even an idea that there is no ontology, or there is no truth, or any of that kind of idea itself, it seems to me, rests upon some sort of understanding of a metaphysics of some kind.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can avoid metaphysics. You don't have to have a Christian metaphysics, it seems to me. But I suppose, if you go back to even Aristotle, metaphysics, it leads you in some way to a natural kind of theology. Need not get you to God in one sense, but nevertheless that seems to be the trajectory, and I'm not sure whether the rejection of metaphysics is a kind of rejection of a natural theology. Maybe it is. Maybe that comes from that enlightenment separation of theology and philosophy. Could be.
Okay, and the last question I really want to ask you, because you have written a lot about particular education, more recently over the last 10, 15 years, is so what do you see as the role of education in contemporary society today?
Well, not what it's currently doing, I would have to say. I mean, it's not like saying that it needn't do what it's doing. I mean, I think people naturally want to get jobs, and education has a role in that. So skills and capacities, development of those kinds of things, all those measurable things that people go on about in schools and universities, they're important. But they're not the whole story, it seems to me. And what we've forgotten in contemporary society are the sorts of things that are formations of human persons. I mean, we've forgotten that that's in itself a vital aspect of what education's about. Well, if we're serious about things like democracy, how do we learn about democracy? What do we understand by democracy? What kind of society do we want to live in? Where does that all come from? Where do we learn about that? Where do we decide about whether or not we're going to respect persons? Are we simply out to do the best we can for ourselves? I mean, in modern liberal democracy, I mean, if we take libertarianism, for example, which is a kind of extreme form of self-interest, it seems to me. If that's what we are, just simply self-interested, then our education presumably is about giving each person exactly what they want. And we have a sort of sense in the modern world currently where the student is a client, is a customer, and the customer wants a certain product, and so our job is to deliver that product. I find that kind of talk quite inimical to what I think education is about. Now, I've been told and criticised for saying, but this is just a way of speaking. Problem is, words have power. One of the things is that language can create a reality. Once I start talking about you as my client, and you see me as delivering a product you want, that changes the relationship.
It's also the language of business, it's the language of economics, which is, if you like, foreign to any sense of what an education truly is. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt there.
No, you're quite right about that. I agree that, that once you start using the language of economics, the language of the market, in describing what you're doing in an area which is not actually much to do with the market, you begin to corrupt the processes that are meant to be there as educational. So to me, the role of education is vital. If we're serious about creating democratic society, then we've got to create a society where people see themselves as cooperating and contributing to each other's welfare at the same time being fulfilled themselves. So, I don't resolve from the fact that obviously people need to get skills, they need to have jobs, because jobs do fulfill, but it's not the whole story. I mean, you know, you could have a really well-paid job, but your life is meaningless. And if your life is meaningless, or you have no fulfillment in that, you know, what do? You turn to drugs? Do you turn to what? I mean, you know, having all of the, you know, it goes right back to Aristotle. Aristotle tells you that, you know, having wealth, having fame, all of those things don't matter. You know, that in fact what matters is fulfilment and the good and virtue. So
the service model, it definitely excludes any notion of the common good.
Well, I think
what that might look like.
I think it does. I mean, we have, of course, in the world today, a kind of understanding that there's no common good.
That's correct.
And this is the
it connects with that notion of truth, which there is no truth. It's a post-truth world.
Yeah, well, we keep talking about post-facts now, you know, or, you know, fake news and all of those kinds of things. Basically now, journalists have abrogated their responsibility in the sense of reporting the truth as far as they can understand that it's no longer important. It's about selling newspapers, and what will sell is not necessarily what's true. It's far better to sensationalise things and say, you know, and to create stories.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it becomes a kind of fiction. We have rather than news, it's fictional news. So it's because that's more interesting, you know, or apparently more interesting. I mean, that's. So I think that I've a little bit off the track here in terms of what education is about. But look, I think it's part of the same brush. I mean, one of the things that education has to instill in people is a respect for each other, but also a respect for truth, and for the notion that there is virtue, that virtue is important, and the kinds of virtues we mean are the, you know, to start with, the cardinal virtues. You know, I mean, is courage important? What's courage actually mean? Perseverance, being able to endure the vicissitudes of life, and being able to persevere in the things that we do, to recognise. I mean, if we go right back to what Socrates says about education, I mean, Socrates' notion of know thyself, and what does that mean? You know, know thyself. Yeah, I know myself. My name is so and so, and you know, I live at such and such a place. That's not what he means by know thyself. What he means by know thyself, know what you are, know the kinds of things you can do, and that you only learn by doing things, by persevering, and the character you develop. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that's part of education which we've forgotten, and it's part of what a democracy is supposed to be about, that I listen to other people's views, I'm active, I'm part of the world around me, I take an interest in what people say to me. So it seems to me education is vital, but it's got to be an education which, it seems to me, involves, and I would argue this, I think there's a need for a spiritual dimension in education as well. Now, I haven't really talked about that at this point, but there is, if religion is important as part of democracy, then religion needs to be part of education in some kind of form or other. And it seems to me we discount a whole area of life, the development and the formation of human beings as persons who respect one another, who have a concern for the truth, who have a concern for the common good, and who have a concern for social justice in the end. To me, if you're not doing all of that, then the rest is kind of frippery. It's not that important.
Now, I'm just noticed the time now. We have gone over a little bit.
Oh, that's all right.
And we could probably talk for a good another hour on a lot of different things, but particularly on this, we could definitely go for another hour. But in that, we've got about 5 minutes. But sorry, I've gone backwards. Apologies, everyone. I wanted to get to this slide here. Now, what I've been holding in here is actually, I've got the physical version here, and I know that the topic of what we've kind of been talking on touches on a lot of themes which can be found in this book here. Before we get to your bibliography and some literature, people who might be interested to kind of do some further reading on work that you've done and the research, just tell us a little about 2 or 3 minutes here about this book and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, this book arose out of a conference, a CommuCap conference, that is the World Union of, or World Group of Catholic Institutes of Philosophy. So it's the group that deals with departments of philosophy that are in Catholic universities. So they're representatives. Now we had a conference in 2015, and the theme of the conference was really looking at this disquiet with the sort of transactional understanding of what education is about, you know, the neoliberal kind of view of education. But what do we do about it? What are the alternatives? So what we've got here is a number of papers drawn from that conference which look at different ways of thinking about education. So the idea clearly is about the idea of what influence does education have in civil society, that is the ordinary world we live in, let alone, you know, the influence in, kind of in the broader notion of the state itself, but civil society. How does it help form civil society? I mean, we're all part of civil society. We all live in neighbourhoods and communities, and how is education to impact on that? It's not just about jobs. It's not just about skills for jobs. It's about human formation as well. So what we have here in this particular volume is a collection of differing views about what that might look like. And they range from looking at some of the stuff what Adorno has to say. There's stuff there from John Paul II. There is you know, a variety of positions. Paul Ricoeur gets a mention. McIntyre, of course, features in a number of papers there, who takes a very different kind of view of the importance of education as an encounter with other kinds of practices and so on. So there's a variety of ways of thinking about education in terms of human formation. So the book covers some of the sort of things we've discussed today,
Sure.
and I think in a very useful kind of way. It doesn't try to be dogmatic about this, but it's trying to portray some differing ways in which we might think about education, drawing back, I suppose, some of the older sort of conceptions of education as being connected to human formation. So yes. I think it's it's trying to give that other dimension.
Sure. Okay, now we've got about 2 minutes.
Right.
And so in about 2 minutes, let's just talk at some literature. This is recent literature.
Yep.
For those who may want to do some further reading in this space, or have a look at some of your work, is there anything in particular here, by the way it goes over the page here too, but is there anything in particular here that, obviously I've got the book we've made reference to, which is the top book there, and then obviously there's 2 sections from the edited book, and then obviously there's your recent publication here in Springer by Religion and Culture and Dialogue, East and West Perspectives, and then you've got some recent stuff from Educational Philosophy and Theory. I'll just go over the page here, and then of course you have that recent book on healthcare ethics. So 2 minutes.
I mean, I guess the sort of themes that I've been interested in are obviously in education, but more broadly in social and political philosophy. I mean, obviously healthcare ethics is important. I mean, there are issues in bioethics also move into the areas of how we understand society and what are the kind of ways in which some of the difficult issues in bioethics are to be dealt with. I mean, you know, there's a range of things. What do we mean? You know, organ donation. There's questions of what that involves. Commercialisation of organs. The question of medical hydration and nutrition, for example. When should it be withdrawn, or should it be withdrawn? Issues to do with experimentation. The artificial reproductive technology, those kinds of things. These are kind of issues which are specifically in bioethics. But there are surrounding these are particular kinds of social and political, philosophical kinds of views about what kinds of values we ought to support and what kinds of values we should have in society. So some of the other stuff that I've got there is partly to do with that. Specifically educational stuff, again, the themes are reasonably constant. The idea of public values, what those should be, the idea of formation, the idea of schools as moral habitats.
Yes.
Again, is trying to take an alternative way of reading what we understand education to be for. So there's a series of, I guess, socio-political kinds of ideas here about the nature of the world, and then how that impinges both in the kind of bioethics area but also in education. So some of that is really related to those sorts of areas that we've been talking about. So there is a kind of thematic grand theme here. Underpinning it is a kind of metaphysics, obviously, a kind of, I'd have to say, a Thomistic metaphysics, which is a realist metaphysics. So I guess partly due to my background in science, so I begin in scientific realism, but also metaphysical. I switch into metaphysical realism. So all of those things are kind of there as a sub-theme, if you like. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming in. We might finish there. Once we get going, it's hard to stop. So, but thank you. Thank you for coming in. I've appreciated it, and thank you for watching.